Hi, and welcome back to The Fourfold Path. I'm Jordan, and I'm really thinking about workshopping that name. I feel ridiculous every time I say it. So, I promised, tabletop RPG sessions, tooling, and retrospectives, and talks about process. And today's really the retrospective and the talk about process. I want to look at the first episode, the first play session that we really had in the game, how that went, and how that worked mechanically. So, starting with the tooling a little bit. So I want to show you starting with the process a little bit. So in Mythic, you play a scene in your role-playing game, and then you update some Mythic states. So let's look at the notes that came out of the session together. So this is a file template I fill in effectively. This was a random scene because we rolled randomly for our starting scene. It happened on this date, and the chaos factor is going to increase as a result of it. I keep track of some of the locations that happened, and as you may or may not recall, Janus and Tony tried to intervene when a group of local frat boys were harassing some girls in a bar. Anthony started a fight. Janus was unwilling to let him get beat, so he joined in. Both eventually got arrested and put in the drunk tank for their efforts. Janus was too broke to call a bondsman, and so instead, and couldn't deal with his girlfriend if he called her, so instead he called his PhD advisor, Tabitha, our main character. She bailed him out, and things escalated when they went to Janus's apartment to, return him after the bailing out, and found out that it had been broken into. So ultimately he ends up staying the night at Tabitha's, and the next scene is, the next morning picking up the pieces, most likely. The rest of these are notes from the session. So, what happened during the bar fight, what happened at the jail and during the bail call, getting back to Janus's apartment, going to Tabitha's apartment, and going back in the morning to Janus's apartment to figure out what had actually happened. So there are some potential threads that we could add in Mythic. These are sort of story beats that we might run down. It might be interesting, for example, to investigate Anthony's legal troubles, because he gets into an additional fight in prison as he's in the holding cell. And of course, getting into another fight while in holding, not good. We obviously might want to run down who broke into Janus's apartment. We might want to try to retrieve Janus's stolen hard drive. There's probably going to be some fallout between Janus and the college as a result of honor code violations. And maybe the frat boys are going to come back to harass Janus and Anthony because, that's how frat boys do. Additionally, there are characters that were generated for the scene. We fleshed out Janus's best friend and Janus's girlfriend, Sarah. They weren't characters in our Mythic setting yet, but we might want to add them. The frat boys that they got in the fight with, and the girls that were being harassed that they were trying to protect, those both could be new characters that we interact with in the future. I've gone ahead and made a name for the person who broke into Janus's house, Crazed Numerologist, because as we discovered, we think that they were trying to steal Janus's research into numerology. And then maybe there's a whole faction that person belongs to. There are also some beat-by-beat notes here. There was a random event. The break-in at Janus's apartment came up because we rolled doubles on D10s when asking the Mythic Oracle question. So we weren't anticipating that event. It sort of came up at random. There's also some notions of how often we rolled in, how often we rolled in Cypher and how often we rolled in Mythic. And then a brief checklist at the end there. Now I want to talk about how we actually generated that, because, I said I'd talk about tools and process. So, we're going to find it in here somewhere. Is it... No, this is notes. Come on, where did I put it? There I put it. So, if you watched the session, or if you didn't, you might have, well, if you watched the session, you would have seen that I was taking notes during play of various events that were happening as I was sort of riffing on what was going on in the scene, right? Like someone broke into Janus's apartment, right? And we might care about who that is. And I did that on note cards and on sticky notes as I was going along, just to make sure that I had sort of a running tally of what was important. But I didn't take a long time writing while I was playing. I just wrote some things down so that I could look at them after the session and record them into more long-form notes. So those are my personal notes from the session over here in this box. I also, because I'm putting this up on YouTube and maybe in podcast format as well, I have a video recording of the session. I stripped the audio out of that using FFmpeg, though it doesn't particularly matter, and then I passed the whole thing through Whisper. Not the online version, but a downloadable Python library that will take audio files and produce timestamp transcripts. So I have personal notes, transcripts, and a prompt that I hand into an LLM that produces that session summary. And then I look at the session summary in conjunction with my own notes and edit it. So let's look at some of the prompts that I'm using here. The scene summary is this one down here. Help me turn the scene... Oh, no, that was how I constructed the scene prompt. Somewhere in here is the prompt. Yeah, so here's the scene summary prompt. So, you know, the standard sort of, here's your persona, here are the things I'd like you to do, and here's the format I want it in, and then guidelines for producing that summary. So specifically, it's supposed to use my notes as the source of truth where there isn't a direct conflict between my notes and the transcript. Where there is, it's supposed to inform me. And then we use that to produce that file. Similarly, I have a location summary prompt that'll give me location notes about all the places that we went during a given session. So give me a brief description of locations from the supplied audio transcript for each location. Tell me a little bit about it. Make sure that it's very short. Try to strip out anything that's specific to the scene. What we're looking for is set dressing for when we return there again. You know, what's the mood, what's going on in the area, and so on, and produce a small file. So let's take a look at one of those locations, like Janus's apartment. So it gives me a few, 100 words on what happened, or what that location is like. And then the big one for me, though, is comparable locations. So this apartment from Mr. Robot, or this place in the wire. Those aren't particularly helpful for me because I am a horrifying Luddite stuck in the 80s, and they're not relevant to shows that I've seen. So I may have to recraft that prompt to target older media, just because my media literacy is, peters out heavily as I entered grad school. So around, 2006, 2007, I really stopped watching as much TV. And so I may have to target those comparables to a different era just to make them more helpful to me. But this description, at least, that's useful for figuring out where I'm coming back into the scene. You'll notice that I've also... So that's how these artifacts are being generated. And it's just the lightest of tooling. So to go back to the pipeline, you're gonna have to record personal notes as you play a session. You have to take some amount of notes. And I personally recommend taking notes during the session. And if you want to do longer form writing or longer form reflection of the game session, you do that afterwards from the notes. You don't want your writing to interrupt the flow of play. And I find that too much writing can do that. Your mileage may vary, of course. But for me, doing long form, like novel style writing during the scene really interrupts the flow of riffing on the last event and sort of like, well, what's the natural thing that's going to happen next? That kind of thinking. while you might not be recording your sessions for upload to the internet, it's not the worst idea in the world to record the audio at the very least. You don't even have to have a very sophisticated mic setup, right? Having a nice quality mic that has crisp audio, that helps. But really, even your built-in PC mic and running it through Whisper, and if you don't have a graphics card that's powerful enough to run these models locally, there's actually Whisper C++, and that'll run right on top of your CPU. And if you're not tech savvy and don't want to install those things yourself, you can always use Whisper as a service online for a fee. And alternatively, you probably have access to something like Zoom or Teams, where you can hold a meeting with yourself and get the transcript that way. All of those things can give you the text that then you can put into any sort of arbitrary large language model to get a summary of that session out. And I would never recommend using the summary that those things produce as the golden standard, right? It's I keep my own notes of the session as a here's what I remember truth being, and the transcript is to fill in details and pieces I missed, right? Well, let's see if there's something from the session where it just didn't align with what I recalled. When I was taking my notes, there are a couple of threads here that I didn't think about, right? The stolen hard drive, the student honor code, the legal troubles for Anthony, and the broken into apartment. But I really did sort of oh yeah, I hadn't considered the fact that perhaps the frat boys will come back and be an issue. So that was something that the LM suggested to me. I was well, maybe. What I need to do now is think about which of these things are going to become real in my setting. So let's take a look at Mythic lists. When you are deciding on the next scenes in Mythic, you suggest what's called an expected scene. This is the thing I think is going to happen next. And you roll against your chaos factor, and as long as you roll within your chaos factor, you get the expected event. But if you roll outside of the chaos factor, or no, is it over? It's been a minute since I've looked. Here, let's take a look at the rule summary. I think we'll say it. Rolling on lists, Fate is RPG rules. Where's the next scene? Yeah, to test the expected scene, if you roll the chaos factor or less and the number is odd, then the scene is altered. Chaos factor or less and it's even, the scene is an interrupt scene. And if you roll the chaos factor or more, you get the expected scene. So, right now, when I enter the next scene, in fact, here, let me just take a note of it. When I enter the next scene, I have a 60% chance of getting an altered scene or an interrupt scene inside of Mythic. And if I get an altered or an interrupt scene, it's going to draw elements from one or both of these lists. And so by adding characters to the list, the interrupt scene might drag me towards a thread that character is involved in. Similarly, by adding threads to the thread list, the interrupt or the altered scene might drag me towards a thread that's in that list. So when I think about what to add to it, it's really a question of, well, where do I want the story to go? Do I care about Janus's beef with the frat boys as a subplot or as a full order thing, right? And that gives me the ability to steer a little bit, because I can say, well, it would be cool if eventually we discovered that a subset of the fraternity or the entirety of this fraternity is actually somehow involved in a numerology cult. But the only way that's ever going to make sense in the fiction is if they were playing a larger role. And so adding them to the list might be a way of making them play a larger role. Conversely, I might say to myself, well, that's dumb, and I don't really care about Janus's beef with random guys around town. It was a bar fight, the brothers at home are going to be like, dumbass, don't get drunk in a bar and then pick a fight with some random guys. That's the easiest way to get kicked out of school and go to jail. Just chill. And say, you know what, I don't want this thread to be important, I'm not going to add it. For my part, I think that the honor code fallout is really well aligned with graduating him whole, and so it makes the subplot of Tabitha getting Janus out the door, like, it pulls in that same direction. Obviously this one pulls directly with the numerology stuff that Tabitha wants to research, so I think those are good, and this comes along with it. I am not, as the player, as interested in Anthony's legal woes or the frat boys, so I'm going to leave those be. In terms of characters, we definitely need Anthony, we definitely need Sarah to be real, and at least the person who broke into Janus's apartment. And I don't want to list them as the crazed numerologist. That's too on the nose. So we're gonna name them as the cat burglar. Well, they weren't a cat burglar. They wrecked up the joint. So they are the person who burgled Janus. Great. That's a great way of remembering them. And because I happen to be using Obsidian, I can click through these things and make them realized files. Changes the highlighting of the thing inside of the file to show me that they have been made real. And it wouldn't be very interesting to watch them happen, happening right now, to have you watch me fill those things out, right? But those are the folks that we're going to add. So we're going to add these 3 characters to the character list. We're going to add these 3 threads to the thread list. Oops. And that's going to give us, 7 or so characters and 5 or so threads, which isn't a bad amount going into the next scene. Ordering wise, I maybe should have shown you this earlier, but let's take a look at the process node. So here are my notes. They're simple notes, handwritten, sort of chronological, beat by beat. Here is what the transcript looks like. I didn't include timestamps because they're not important. I just asked Whisper to produce the transcript itself. And so it's just a nice long stream of text, a little bit of white space here and there where I've got hard stops in the sentences and it thinks it identifies paragraphs, but nothing too special. So let me see what other major beats I wanted to hit before I get on out of here and move on to the next play session. Bookkeeping and Obsidian is where we just were. Yeah, so if you watched the last session, this is more of a retro kind of thing. I rolled more in Mythic than I rolled in Cypher. I was looking for meaning, I was looking for plot beats, I was looking to see sort of what happened in the scene. There were only really 2 places that I engaged with the mechanics, and it was when Tabitha was searching Janus's apartment. And in hindsight even, I feel bad about making those rolls. So let me talk about why that is. There's a real good argument for having had a fight scene in the bar, leaving it up to mechanics as to whether or not Janus and Anthony won in their fight against the frat boys. But I didn't do it for a couple of reasons. First of, it's hard to hold my hand out in such a way that you can read it. So first of all, it wasn't interesting. It was, whether or not they won the fight was kind of unimportant. They were gonna get picked up by the cops for getting into a brawl in a bar with bouncers. Like, that was just the way that was always gonna end. So there wasn't an interesting story thing to do in getting in that bar fight. And that was the first chance to really do rolls. It wasn't gonna be interesting for Janus to try to convince Tabitha to bail him out if Tabitha had said no, that was sort of the end of Janus's story right there. And there are a couple of other people in the tabletop space who have done a better job than me talking about narrative killing questions. They also come up inside of the Mythic book, where it's a question where if the answer is no or yes, depending on how you ask it, but one of the answers just destroys the run of the narrative. And so I did make 2 rolls, one for Janus to look for what was stolen from his apartment, and one for Tabitha to look for what was stolen from Janus's apartment. And like, I really feel like I shouldn't have made those rolls, because if they hadn't discovered what had been removed, that would have... where was the narrative going to go from there? And there's an argument of, well, they still might care about who broke into Janus's apartment, but if they have literally 0 leads and their only action is to wait on the police to inform them, you know, then the threads that come out of there are a little bit different. It's like wait on a police call and deal with some of the other Fallout kinds of things. Like having effectively a timed event waiting in the wings to be rolled. But that wasn't interesting, right? And so maybe instead of forcing Janus and Tabitha to roll to find the missing hard drive, I should have asserted that they were going to find what was stolen and had them roll to find some scrap of the thief that was there. For example, to give them more of a lead. As it is, they're in a pretty tight spot. They only know what was stolen, which gives them some visibility into who might have broken in, because the number of people who would be interested in stealing Janus's hard drive and know what's on it should be quite limited, right? And that's probably going to be the thrust of the next scene if it's the expected scene is, well, who the hell knew that you were looking at this stuff, and where are they so that we can go talk to them? But there's a real argument to be made that I shouldn't have asked that question, because it could have just ended the narrative. In terms of the mythic questions, several of my mythic rolls were on random tables, and I rolled because I didn't like the original roll, or I didn't have a good interpretation of the original roll. I don't feel bad about that. I didn't get like 4 and 5 random events. I got 1 over the course of a session with a 50% chaos factor. That doesn't feel too bad. So I'm not too worried about that. The last thing I want to talk about is the decision. So 2 things, right? There was the option. It wasn't the option. There's always the option. I had in mind a opening set piece, I can't remember what Mythic calls it, an inspired scene, I believe it is, for the first scene. My thought was that Tabitha was going to have been invited to the opening of a new installation at the local Natural History Museum, showing the mysteries of the ancient Pythagorean cult, right? Like some obvious, on-the-nose call to adventure related to one of her threats. I was like, I like that plot hook. It's good. It aligns with sort of the mystic angle I want the game to take. It's going to let me drag her towards her transition into this new world. Perfect. That's a good idea. But then I was thinking, and I said to myself, well, the thing that I see when I look at Reddit or the solo RPG discords, or even hear other people who play and make content for them talk, is that people often feel like they don't know where to get in, how to do an opening scene, how to deal with random scenes in Mythic if that's their GM emulator of choice, or if they're playing a system that requires a GM emulator. And so like, okay, fine. I can roll up a random scene and probably roll with the punches. And my interpretation of the seeds for that scene being Janus gets into a fistfight. Why would a college student get into a fistfight? Why would this college student in specific get into a fistfight? And then, okay, well, here's another alternative opening scene. And I'm happy with where it went, because it gives me an opportunity to explore the relationship between Janus and Tabitha, which is another thing that I want in the story and that's important to the story. So instead of chasing down the plot beat that I was most excited about, I'm chasing down sort of an emotional beat between two characters that I'm also excited about. So, like, I'm not sad about that. And then the other thing that happened in the episode is when we went to Janus's home, we rolled a random event. And there were going to be emergency vehicles out there, and there was a question of if it was going to be fire or police. We ended up with police and how to interpret that. There were lots of ways that I could have interpreted the fact that there were cops there. There could have been a domestic dispute between the neighbors. Sarah, Janus's girlfriend, could have been upset that he wasn't answering his phone and caused a disturbance outside of the apartment complex. And or a couple of other things. Each one would have been opening up a new thread in Mythic and sort of branching our narrative outwards, right? Like making it spread. Instead, what we chose to do was to say, okay, well, there's this random event. There are police cars here. I'm going to fold Janus and that arc of the narrative back into Tabitha's, specifically by saying, look, Janus is into numerology. That was sort of a new thing we established, is Janus being into numerology. Also that someone believes enough in the value of numerological research to break into a college kid's apartment and steal his research. So now we've both connected Janus and Tabitha on this new axis that they weren't aware of and they're both mildly ashamed of, and also introduced a antagonist as a goad in this side of the world. So I feel like that's going to work really, really well. But the thing I mean to point out here is that there are a couple of ways to use these random events. Like, yeah, the GM emulator is saying, okay, in this particular case, you need to come up with a whole new scene or a whole new character or a whole new plot thread. But that doesn't actually mean adding variety into the story you're telling. It can be a great opportunity for it to introduce a whole new thing to go explore for the characters, either in terms of the world or in terms of themselves. But if you're aware of the other sort of contexts that are going on in your story, you can say, okay, well, I'm going to add a new layer to this already ongoing thing and pull the story back in along this arc. I was just listening to the, oh shoot, what is it called? My cell phone is over here. Do I dare open up Spotify long enough to look at the name of this podcast? I dare, I say. The Solo Role Players podcast. Why couldn't I have thought of that? He had Man Alone on, or maybe it was in the previous episode, and they were talking about yam-shaped stories and how you sort of branch outward until you get to a sufficient width, and then you cull things, and then you tie your threads back together, and you come back to a conclusion and a denouement. Beyond two random yahoos on the internet talking about solo role-playing games, though, I think that their thoughts on the subject are well-formed, and I enjoy their podcasts immensely. Kurt Vonnegut was also talked about sort of the shape of stories, rising action, and so on, usually in terms of emotional highs and lows of the character. And so you can also think of it in that way, like, how am I going to use this random event? Am I going to use it to bolster my character up or drag my character down? And often Mythic will tell you directionally where you're going there. It'll be NPC positive, NPC negative. So you get sort of a sense of who's being affected how. But I did like the solo, let's go with the thought leaders in the solo role-playing game space. I did like sort of their discussion of yam-shaped stories and the notion of widening versus contracting, because it aligns with how I've been using those tools for a while, though I didn't have language around it that I liked. So I'm going to steal that because it's good. So going forward, There are a couple of things I want to do. I wanted to do before the next PlayStation, but play session, but I'm not going to let them get in the way. I was mucking around with getting some tokens for this board because I'd like to have, if I ever have to do combat or area exploration. So I went and fetched my wet erase markers from work. Those are Sharpies. Let us not tempt fate. I went and fetched my wet erase markers from work so that I could, draw on my mat and maybe make rooms and whatnot, and do combat sessions that way, or any kind of exploration session that way, and just sort of hallucinate rooms as I go. That's going to be more difficult with a randomly generated game. I could have some templates, or I've seen enough buildings in my time to know how to draw things. But the other thing I wanted to do in using this mat is I was going to print out, 3D print some hexagonal characters. At that size, it's probably not big enough for it to resolve really well on YouTube, to be honest with you. But I could probably get a glyph in there or a character name that was large enough to be read on camera. And if not on that side, then I can also do it on the square side. And just, if the single hexes are too small, I can use a 2x2 square to get it done. And that would give me some nice visual flair if we did sessions that had more tactical combat. I don't tend to run games with tactical combat. It tends not to be my style. I prefer more theater of the mind style fighting because, well, in my heart of hearts, I like authoring. I like writing. I'm not a screenplay kind of a gal. So I don't really need the choreography of the fight. In most cases, I need the emotional grit of the fight, the pain, the desperation, and so on. And you can get there without specific choreography. You can get all of the tempo you need from simpler representations and abstractions, and so that's what I prefer to run. The other thing that I had in mind escapes me at the moment. So yeah, I think that from here out, my plan is to sit down and finish the bookkeeping from the previous episode, get everything ready, and then probably not on camera, off camera, think about what the expected scene is for next time. And then when we come back for the second play episode, we're gonna start by testing the expected scene and either proceeding or going into a random session. And I look forward to seeing you all again then. Until then.